Some truths do not die. They are simply folded, sealed, and left unread. This story begins in the hush of Baker Street, where a single page, long buried, threatens to undo more than a name. It trembles at the edges of memory, legacy, and silence. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. Come closer now. The drawer is about to open, and with it, a question that may never find its answer. It was on a grey and mist-laden morning in early November that I found myself once again in our familiar lodgings at Baker Street, where the lamp burned low despite the hour, and the window panes wore a fine tracing of dew. London, in such moments, became a city of breath and silence, the clang of hansoms muffled by the damp, the bells of St Marylebone receding into vapour. Holmes had been uncommonly quiet for several days, lost in one of those long meditations that seemed to require neither nourishment nor speech. I sat opposite him, reviewing a monograph on renal injuries in cavalry officers, when a sharp rap sounded below, followed by the crisp, measured tread of someone for whom hesitation was a professional liability. Holmes lifted his gaze only slightly. "I believe, Watson," he murmured, "we are about to be presented with a matter of paper, not blood, and one whose ink is older than the visitor who brings it." The man who entered bore the unmistakable seal of legal discretion, grey-streaked hair, gloves of fine leather worn at the fingertips, and a portfolio whose clasp was polished as though it were a badge of office. He introduced himself without flourish. "My name is Percy Lanchester, of Lanchester and Burley, solicitors to the late estate of Sir Alaric Bellamy." Holmes gestured to the chair by the fire. "I confess, Mr. Lanchester, your name is not unfamiliar. I recall your firm's involvement in the matter of the Hanoverian codicil, an elegant legal entanglement, if memory serves." Lanchester allowed himself a brief smile. "You are well read, Mr. Holmes, but I come today not on behalf of the firm, but at the request of Lady Frances Bellamy, the poet's daughter." At the mention of the name, Holmes's fingers steepled with interest. "The poet is dead," continued Lanchester. "His legacy, however, has developed a complication. In the archives of Pembroke College, Oxford, a document has recently surfaced, the final letter of Sir Alaric, believed to have been penned days before his death. A draft, if we are generous, but bearing his hand without doubt." "And you believe it genuine?" Holmes asked. "I do. Yet the letter is missing its final page, one that was indisputably present during its recent cataloguing." Holmes tilted his head. "And its absence is cause for concern." Lanchester's voice lowered. "Its presence is cause for disgrace." From his portfolio, Lanchester drew a thin envelope lined with tissue and placed it upon the desk, as one might lay down a confession. Holmes opened it with care and extracted a single sheet, its ink aged but legible, its paper bearing the watermark of a press long out of use. The letter, written in Bellamy's unmistakable hand, fluid, expansive, yet tinged with hesitation, was both philosophical and personal. It began as a meditation on posterity, on the cruelty of memory, and the burden of artistic truth. But midway through a sentence that promised revelation, the narrative simply ceased, not concluded, but amputated. "There was more," said Lanchester, leaning forward. "The librarian at Pembroke swears that when he first handled the letter, it ended with a line beginning, 'And so, to the one I betrayed most.' But now that line is gone, replaced by a torn edge, as if sliced by a careful hand." Holmes's eyes narrowed, scanning the paper's margin. "And the archive was secure?" "Double-locked, and accessed only by 3 individuals, none of whom admit to seeing the letter in this condition." Holmes's fingers passed slowly along the cut. "It is not only the poet who haunts this page, Mr. Lanchester. There is someone living who fears the words it once held." Lanchester sat back in his chair, his voice tinged with weariness. "Lady Frances Bellamy is a woman of high reserve. She has long acted as her father's literary executor and has guarded his posthumous reputation with quiet ferocity. When the letter came to light, She requested that the archive delay its cataloguing. The librarian refused. Which is why, Holmes said quietly, it was necessary for someone to delay it by other means. She does not admit to any knowledge of the page's removal, said Lanchester, but she has asked me to ensure it does not reappear. She believes, and I'm inclined to agree, that its content may contain a reference to a scandal of authorship, or possibly worse. Worse than literary theft, I asked. Lanchester met my eyes. There was, in his final years, talk of a woman, a figure on the margins. Some say he had taken to claiming works that were not entirely his own. His daughter fears disgrace, Holmes murmured. She fears destruction of her father's work, of her own name, and of a mother whose silence was never fully explained. Holmes folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope. Then we must begin where all scandal lives longest, Mr. Lanchester, in ink. Long after Lanchester's departure, Holmes remained by the fire, the letter unopened on the table between us. He had lit his pipe, but had not drawn from it. His gaze turned toward the window where the fog had thickened to a colourless veil. I find myself intrigued, Watson, he said at last, not by what was written, but by what was never intended for reading. He tapped the corner of the envelope. Consider, if you will, the psychology of omission. To remove a page from a dead man's letter is to claim authority over his memory. It is to sculpt legacy not with words, but with silence. You believe the missing page contains a confession. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Perhaps, or perhaps only a suggestion of one. And that, I fear, is more dangerous. The mind fills in what the eye cannot see. A torn final line invites not curiosity, but invention. A scandal half seen burns longer than one declared. And the motive, I asked, not money, he said softly, but legacy, reputation, and those who live off its fragile shadow. The following morning, Lanchester returned, this time with a thin, leather-bound case bearing a brass clasp. He opened it with a small key drawn from a chain about his neck, and inside, carefully wrapped in blotting paper and tied with silk, lay the original letter. Holmes examined it without haste. He sniffed the edge, held it to the light, and with gloved fingers traced the line where the missing page had once been attached. There was no tearing, he murmured. No haste. This was sliced, likely with a fine instrument, possibly a scholar's paper knife. The edge is deliberate. He turned the sheet over. There are fingerprints in the margin, slight, not ink-stained, but more than one. Holmes placed the letter aside. The page is missing not due to time, but to intent. Someone wished it gone, and someone else may still possess it. Mr. Lanchester, I presume the library's records note who accessed the letter in the week prior to its alteration. They do. Then we shall begin there, said Holmes, standing at last. Let us hope, Watson, that whoever stole the page did not also write upon it. It was still early when we left Baker Street, the London fog clinging like ash to the lapels of our coats, and the gas lamps winking dimly above shuttered shops. There was no carriage summoned. Holmes preferred to walk on such mornings, when the case at hand carried the scent not of blood, but of paper and ink. The British Museum, he said tersely, houses more secrets than any criminal quarter in Whitechapel, though its inmates are bound in leather rather than chains. I accompanied him in silence, accustomed by now to his mood when a case dealt with the subtleties of the mind. There was something peculiarly grave in his manner, a stillness that seemed not fatigue, but focus compressed to its finest edge. As we passed Russell Square and approached the pillared entrance of the museum, Holmes slowed, his gaze fixed upon a group of pigeons scattering from the damp steps. Observe, Watson, he said softly. Even birds avoid knowledge too long entombed. I replied that perhaps they preferred crumbs to cryptic letters. Holmes gave no answer. He only tapped once upon the carved door with the end of his cane and stepped inside, as though entering the past. Within the echoing chambers of the British Museum, we were met with a stillness that seemed deeper than quiet, the hush of old scholarship and long-forgotten voices. The reading room, with its great dome and concentric shelves, felt less a library than a cathedral of thought. Holmes moved with certainty, as one long familiar with its hushed authority. The librarian, a gaunt man in spectacles whose expression bore the habitual suspicion of those entrusted with fragile things, emerged from behind his desk with the measured gait of one roused from dry meditation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with a faint inclination of his head, "I had wondered if your interest might be drawn. I fear, Mr. Swithin, it is not my interest but someone else's absence which has brought me." Swithin gestured to a wooden folder set upon the central table. "The Bellamy document. It has not been touched since the incident." Holmes gave a slight nod. "And who handled it last?" The librarian hesitated. "Aside from your man from Lancaster and Burley, only one other. A young foreigner, polite but evasive. Name?" "Provided one, yes," Swithin said tightly, "though I suspect it belonged to someone else." Holmes opened the folder with reverence and precision. Within it lay the same letter we had examined the day before, though in this new light, under the glass ceiling and the judgment of centuries, it seemed more fragile, more haunted. He drew the sheet toward him, allowing his gaze to absorb each line before reading aloud. "Posterity, I fear, will judge not the worth of my verse, but the concealment of my truth." The sentence stopped abruptly, not with a period, but in mid-breath, as though the pen itself had hesitated or been forcibly removed. Holmes leaned closer. "The wound is not internal," he murmured. "It is surgical. Look here, Watson. See the edge, cut, not torn. There is intent, not accident." There was something painful in seeing such elegant handwriting end in ruin, as if the poet's very voice had been sliced short, denied its final syllable. "Bellamy's words reached toward confession," Holmes said, "but the voice that silenced him did so without ink." I glanced about the room, at the endless shelves, the dust motes spiralling in still air, and for the first time felt that even knowledge, if tampered with, could bleed. Holmes turned the sheet delicately, as though the parchment were skin bruised by time. Along its lower edge, he held it to the light. And I saw them too, small irregularities, discolorations that mark not mere age, but recent harm. "Water," Holmes said, "but not soaked, touched, dabbled." He produced his lens and examined the fibres. "The paper here has swelled, ever so faintly. The oils are uneven. Someone handled it with damp hands, perhaps perspiring, or else trying to cleanse something they ought not to have touched." His eye traced further. "And here, fibres bent the wrong way. A knife, not recent, but sharp. Possibly a scalpel, more likely a blade from a paper knife, of the sort used by literary men or careful thieves. Do you believe the page was removed here, in the reading room?" He shook his head. "No, the cut is too clean. It was excised elsewhere and returned in hope the absence would go unnoticed." "Then why the water?" "Because the one who returned it," Holmes replied, "was nervous or remorseful." He set the letter down and turned sharply to the librarian. "Now then, Mr. Swithin, let us speak of your Austrian guest." Swithin stiffened. "He arrived 4 days ago, claiming to be a Mr. Edward Mallory, a doctoral candidate from Vienna. His letter of reference was impressively forged. I compared it later against our records. The seal was correct, the tone too florid by half." Holmes sat back in the high reading chair, steepling his fingers. "Describe him. Young, early 30s, pale complexion, but with dark brows. He wore gloves inside, which I found odd. He asked after only 2 items, the Bellamy letter and a volume of Mrs. Bellamy's private correspondence." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "He knew then of her existence?" "It would appear so." Did he ask to copy the document? Swithin nodded reluctantly. He said he would only make notes. We do not permit direct transcription. I did not see a camera, but I did see him tremble. Holmes rose. You have described a man hiding more than nationality. Did he leave an address? None that proved verifiable. Holmes glanced at me, his voice now carrying the glint of the chase. A ghost in the Reading room, Watson. And a ghost with ink on his gloves. Holmes bent again over the severed margin of the letter. With a gloved finger, he tapped once, then twice, on the corner of the paper. There is residue here, he said. Not visible at first glance, but under direct light. He tilted the page toward the window, and I saw it. A faint, purplish streak, scarcely more than a breath of colour, like the bruising of old lilac. Ink, he confirmed, but not from Bellamy's era. Modern? Holmes shook his head. Obsolete. This hue was peculiar to a Cambridge press that ceased operations in 1882. They used a unique blend. Crushed aniline with traces of cobalt. You believe the missing page was rewritten? I believe it was either forged or resealed with such ink in an effort to mask its passage. Holmes straightened. The page we seek may yet exist. And if so, it is in the hands of someone attempting to rewrite history, not with scholarship, but with deceit. I felt then a chill, not from the air, but from the idea that even confession could be forged. That truth, once stolen, might be sold again with interest. We exited the Reading room into the thickening dusk, the sky above Bloomsbury now painted in shades of slate and sorrow. Holmes walked in silence, his cane tapping thrice in steady rhythm against the stone. I dared not interrupt his thoughts, for I recognized the sound. It was the cadence of pattern emerging, of facts aligning in that singular, unfathomable mind. Only once did he speak, and it was half to himself. Borrowed names, obsolete ink, and silence more eloquent than poetry. He said no more, but I knew from his gait that the hunt had truly begun. It was in the understated bustle of the museum's administrative wing that Holmes placed a discreet inquiry through the archives office, requesting the names of all recent foreign readers who had accessed the Bellamy collection within the past week. The response arrived not an hour later, hand-delivered by a junior clerk whose ink-stained cuffs betrayed a hasty transcription. There were only 4 names on the ledger. One had already belonged to Mr. Lanchester. 2 others were of known academics, both corroborated by their home institutions. The 4th, however, stood out not for what it revealed, but for how quickly it had arrived. Anton Kreutz, Vienna, the entry read, entered with oddly precise penmanship, as if guided by a practiced hand unaccustomed to error. Holmes noted the rapidity with which the name had been confirmed. Too smooth, he remarked. The sort of smoothness that comes not from truth, but rehearsal. He directed the clerk to the hotel registry office across the street, which yielded a single match. A Mr. Kreutz had taken residence at the Albemarle, a modest hotel near Piccadilly, known for hosting foreign guests of scholarly persuasion. Holmes tucked the slip into his coat. Come, Watson, I should like to meet a man whose alias is more legible than his intent. The Albemarle Hotel stood discreetly among a row of Georgian terraces, its facade unimposing, its brass plate modestly polished. Inside, the scent of camphor and boiled carpets clung faintly to the hallways, mingling with the rustle of newspapers and the polite coughs of guests unseen. Holmes presented a visiting card at the desk, and we were met by a young concierge, whose composure faltered only slightly when Holmes gave the name Kreutz. Indeed, sir, the boy replied, wringing his hands in the folds of his uniform. Mr. Kreutz has been in residence for 3 nights. Very quiet, sir. Mostly keeps to his room. Doesn't ring for the morning paper. Does his own washing up, if you can believe it. Holmes raised a brow. A man who prefers his own stains. The concierge gave a nervous chuckle. 3rd floor, end of the corridor. Room facing the street. We call it the third window. He always keeps the curtain drawn. As we mounted the stairs, Holmes paused midway and gestured to the wall. Smell that, Watson? I inhaled. There was something acrid, faint, like scorched parchment and violet ink long dried. He's working, Holmes said softly, or hiding something that was. The man who opened the door was younger than I had expected, no more than 30, with a scholar's pallor and the withdrawn gaze of one who has spent more hours with books than with men. He wore spectacles rimmed in wire and a collar whose starch had long surrendered to fatigue. Yes? He inquired, his voice polite but guarded. Holmes introduced himself with courteous directness. We come regarding a document recently examined in the reading room, the Bellamy letter. May we speak? A flicker crossed Creutz's eyes. Not fear exactly, but something between hesitation and calculation. He stepped aside. If it is brief. The room was sparsely furnished, a desk crowded with notepaper, a tin of sealing wax, and a dog-eared copy of Bellamy's collected works occupied one corner. There was a faint trace of ink in the air, more chemical than literary. Holmes moved not toward the desk, but toward the hearth. You study English literature? Romanticism, Creutz replied quickly, with a focus on posthumous reputation. A delicate subject, Holmes murmured. And your interest in Sir Alaric? I admire his verse, said Creutz. Nothing more. Nothing, Holmes echoed, is often the most rehearsed answer of all. As Holmes spoke of poetic structures and forgotten influences, a conversation which appeared to flatter Creutz, I noticed my friend's gaze drift not toward the man, but toward the objects in his room. His manner remained affable, but his attention was surgical. It was as Creutz turned to retrieve a journal from his desk that Holmes's eye briefly paused upon a folio resting atop a low chest. Peeking from beneath its leather flap was something dark and crumpled. A glove, left hastily, almost guiltily, as though it had been thrust there without thought. Holmes moved toward the folio under the guise of idle curiosity. May I? Creutz turned, but not swiftly enough to conceal the tremor in his voice. That is, only notes. Holmes lifted the folio an inch, just enough to confirm the object beneath. The glove was of soft kid leather, right-handed, and stained along the thumb and forefinger with a faint purplish hue. He said nothing of it. Instead, he closed the folio with care and turned back to Creutz. Mr. Creutz, he said mildly, may I offer a brief hypothesis? The Austrian swallowed. Yes? Holmes smiled, but not kindly. You did not come to London for poetry. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the coals settling in the hearth. Then Creutz sat down, as though some internal thread had snapped behind his spine. I did not steal it, he whispered. I was asked. Holmes's voice remained steady. By whom? Creutz shook his head, hands clasped tightly. I gave my word, a promise made. I cannot. You already have, Holmes replied. Creutz buried his face in his hands, then lifted it again, pale and slick with perspiration. I was in Oxford last spring. I met her there, Lady Frances. She was reading in the gardens. She spoke to me of Bellamy and of her mother. Holmes's eyes flickered. She told you what she suspected. She feared the truth more than the lies, Creutz murmured. And she said, if the page ever came to light, it would ruin them both. And so I did as I was asked, Creutz said quietly. I removed it, only temporarily. I was to return it once it had disappeared elsewhere. Holmes nodded. But you could not bring yourself to finish the deed. No, Creutz said, because I read it. And with that, he looked away, as if the ink had marked not his glove, but his conscience. There was something pitiable in Creutz. Not pitiable in the vulgar sense of failure or weakness, but in that deeper register of a mind devoured by loyalty it scarcely understood. He had the look of a man who believed himself a servant of a cause too vast, too sacred for examination. He sat with his hands pressed together, as if still praying for exoneration. Holmes, uncharacteristically quiet, regarded him with a gaze not of judgment, but of consideration. "You are not a forger," Holmes said, "not even a thief. You are, at best, a student of danger who mistook devotion for discretion." "I wanted to protect her," Kreutz murmured. "From what?" I asked. He hesitated. "From the past, from truth that does not age." Outside, the wind scraped faintly against the panes. Holmes reached for his gloves. "You have returned the letter, but not the page. Where is it now?" Kreutz looked at us, not evasively, but with something nearer to reverence. "Safe." Holmes nodded once. "You may remain here for the present," he said. "But if that page vanishes again, you will not be the one pursued. It will be she." And in that moment, I saw Kreutz flinch. As we descended the narrow staircase of the Albemarle, Holmes said nothing for a while. It was only when we reached the street, where the fog had begun to rise like old regrets, that he spoke, almost absently. "Kreutz is no liar," he said, "but neither is he in control." "Then who is?" Holmes lit a match. "The one who gave him the ink-stained glove, and the motive." He exhaled, watching the smoke curl into the dusk. "And we must find her, Watson, not to uncover what she fears, but to understand why she feared it first." The road to Oxfordshire lay stretched beneath a sky shorn of colour, not yet storming, but hollowed out, like something stripped of its song. The hedgerows, dense and overgrown, whispered in the windless air as though they remembered secrets better left buried. I watched Holmes as we rode in silence, his gaze fixed not on the path ahead, but on some internal map, traced in logic and unspoken doubts. "We are not seeking a criminal, Watson," he said at last, "but someone who fears history more than consequence." "Do you mean Lady Frances?" "Possibly," he replied, "or the shadow she carries." We passed through the last of the hedges and into a narrow lane, the countryside now giving way to wide stone walls and yew trees bent from neglect. There was something heavy in the air, not just dampness, but memory grown sour with time. It was not merely a visit, I thought, but an uninvited return. Penderyn House revealed itself gradually, not through grandeur, but through a certain refusal to vanish. The iron gate was half swallowed by ivy, its lock rusted and ornamental now, as though the estate had long since ceased to demand protection from the outside world. The gravel drive was uneven, overrun by creeping weeds that whispered underfoot. A man of uncertain age answered our approach, a groundsman perhaps, or a caretaker whose duties were few. He led us without word through an antechamber whose tapestries had dulled and curled from damp, into a parlour heavy with the scent of camphor and faded roses. It was a house not of ruin, but of resistance, as if morning had laid claim to every corner and refused to yield. Holmes took it in with a sweep of his glance, his expression unreadable. His fingers brushed the edge of a chair as though testing its weight, not its fabric. "She does not entertain visitors," the groundsman said before disappearing. And then, the hush of another presence. She entered without sound, tall and slender, dressed in deep green that verged upon black. Her face was composed, her eyes not warm, but neither hostile. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "Dr. Watson, you may sit." Lady Frances Bellamy did not so much speak as permit conversation. There was a deliberate poise in her bearing, not haughtiness, but a careful withholding that seemed learned, even rehearsed. Her features were finely drawn, but her expression held little softness. If grief had once touched her, it had long since been pressed into ritual. "You have come," she said. "About the letter?" Holmes inclined his head. "We have, Lady Frances. You are aware, I presume, that it was tampered with." "I am aware that its absence is preferable to its content." Her gaze did not flinch. "My father's legacy is bound by the public's reverence. That is delicate clay, Mr. Holmes. It must not be muddied." "But you believe it has been," Holmes replied evenly. "By the page now missing." She did not answer at once. Then, "What is gone is gone. And yet," Holmes said softly, "it may still speak." She met his gaze. Not challengingly, but as one accustomed to measuring others and finding them insufficient. "What do you hope to discover?" Holmes did not smile. Whether what was written matters more than why it was never read. Her silence was not evasive. It was armour. The hearth had not been lit, though the cold lingered like a resident. Above it, a large frame hung covered in thick drapery, the kind reserved for mourning or concealment, and rarely for modesty. Holmes's eyes, drawn to it as naturally as a needle to the pole, rested on its veiled presence with a kind of quiet challenge. "You do not display your father's likeness?" he asked. Lady Frances sipped her tea. He preferred to be remembered by his words. "And yet," Holmes said, "those are the very things now in dispute." Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the china. "The portrait was painted before my mother's death. It no longer serves." Holmes did not press the matter. He only glanced once more at the hidden canvas, and I saw in that glance the same question form in his mind as in mine, whether it was the poet that she had hidden, or the eyes beside him. The late Sir Alaric Bellamy's study was preserved with the reverence of a reliquary. The heavy oak desk, though polished, bore no sign of recent use. Its surface was bare, save for a lamp with a soot-darkened shade, and a silver letter opener that had not cut paper in years. Holmes moved through the room with the stillness of a physician in a sick room, alert but unhurried. He paused at the desk, his fingers tapping twice on the edge before gently testing each drawer. Most yielded easily, empty compartments, blank stationery, a dried-up inkwell, but the lowest on the left resisted. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a thin blade, which he slipped beneath the wood just above the lock. With a soft click, the drawer released. Inside lay a bundle of scorched paper, the edges blackened, the scent of old smoke rising faintly like a ghost reluctant to depart. He withdrew them one by one. Most were fragments, unintelligible, until the last. It was a torn half-sheet, yellowed and brittle, bearing a single line in a script I did not recognize. Holmes handed it to me. "Read it, Watson." And I did, my voice quieter than I expected. Fate was decided not in verse, but in the silence between, I read aloud. The words echoed softly in the stillness, as though they had been waiting for an ear, any ear, to give them life once more. They were not dramatic, nor accusatory, yet they struck a nerve far deeper than explicit confession. Holmes stood with his arms folded, his gaze not upon the paper, but upon the window beyond the desk, where the trees swayed in a windless sky. "A line," he said, "that belongs neither to poetry nor to grief, but to regret." He turned toward me. "It is not what was written that weighs heavily here. It is what was left unsaid." And though I could not explain why, I felt suddenly that Lady Frances had not feared her father's sins, but the shadows that her mother's silence had allowed to remain. As we departed Penderyn House, the clouds hung lower, as if burdened by the same truth that pressed upon its occupants. Holmes walked without comment until we reached the outer gate, where he paused and turned back once, not toward the house, but toward the hedges, as though searching for something that had long fled. "You were quiet," I remarked. "I was listening," he replied. "To what?" "To what was not said," he murmured. "Lady Frances spoke often of her father's reputation, never of his character. You believe she suspects the truth?" "I believe she knows it, not in fact, but in marrow. And it is not the scandal she dreads, but the confirmation." He placed a hand on the rusted gate. "This is not the end of a case, Watson. It is the start of a reckoning." And with that, he opened the gate, and the silence of the countryside swallowed us once more. The hour was not yet noon when a sharp, officious knock broke the stillness of our Baker Street sitting room. A knock I knew at once for its lack of hesitation. Moments later, Inspector Lestrade stepped in, coat still damp from the mist outside. and bearing a look of mingled irritation and suppressed amusement. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "it seems you've taken up a second profession, forgery no less." Holmes, seated by the fire with a volume of Horace in his lap, did not look up. "If the charge is literary, I ask that you speak slowly. The punishment may be critical review." Lestrade snorted. "I've had an anonymous note, no name of course, claiming you're tied to a ring of forgers peddling fake manuscripts. A bookseller near Charing Cross filed a statement after being shown a page supposedly from Bellamy's last letter. Said it bore your signature as witness to authenticity." Now Holmes looked up, and there was, for a flicker, something colder than humour in his eyes. "Then someone," he said softly, "has gone to great lengths to drag my name into this little play." He stood. "Watson, shall we pay a visit to a man who sells truth by the inch?" The shop was tucked between two shuttered tobacconists, its signage so faint one might take it for dust. Within, the rare book dealer proved to be a man of folded shoulders and fingernails darkened by ink and antiquity. He blinked at Lestrade, but recognised Holmes at once, and flinched. "I meant no disrespect, sir," he said, wringing his hands. "But I had to report it. It was your name, clear as print." "Start at the beginning," Holmes said. "What was brought to you, and by whom?" The man hesitated. "A week past, a foreigner, young, nervous, offered me a page said to be from the lost letter of Sir Alaric Bellamy, very fine parchment, authentic watermark. I turned it away. And then? 3 days later, another fellow came, English, tall, thin, claimed to be you." Holmes raised a brow. "Convincing?" "Uncannily so. Wore the same style of coat, same speech, dry, clipped. He brought a copy of the same page. Only this time, there was a slip attached, stating you had examined and approved it." Lestrade leaned forward. "And you still have it?" "I kept the receipt," the man said, "but the page." He took it back. Holmes requested to see the shop's log, and the dealer obliged with a ledger whose entries ran in tidy but faded script. Holmes's finger paused midway down the page. "Here," he said, tapping once. 2 entries. One initialed AK, 3 days before the second, which is marked by my name in block letters. A crude touch. The dealer shifted uncomfortably. "The first visitor, Kreutz. He left nothing but a name and a scent of sweat. The second, well, sir, it was uncanny. He moved like you, spoke like you. He even tapped his cane in 3s. Too well rehearsed," Holmes murmured. "Did you notice anything else?" I asked. The man thought. He wore gloves, though it was not cold, and he kept glancing at a pocket watch, not to check the hour, mind you, but as if waiting for it to strike. Holmes's expression darkened, and for the first time, I sensed more than professional irritation. This was intrusion, into method, into reputation, perhaps even into memory. "You said he took the page with him?" "Yes," said the dealer, "but not before leaving a name. Just one." Holmes folded his arms. "Let me guess," he said. "Lennox Vale." The dealer retrieved a thin receipt from a locked drawer. A yellowing slip bearing Holmes's name at the bottom in a hand so familiar that even I blinked. Holmes examined it under the lamplight. "An admirable imitation," he said at last. "The curvature of the H, the precision of the tail on the S. But look here, Watson. The ink bleeds. My fountain never does." He returned the paper to Lestrade. "It is not only a forgery," he said. "It is a performance, and it was meant to be discovered." Lestrade frowned. "To what end?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "To call me into the narrative, or rather, into the accusation. The question is not who forged the name, but why they wanted me blamed." He turned toward the door. "Come, Watson, we must reacquaint ourselves with a ghost." "Vale," I said as we stepped into the foggy street once more. "Why does that name feel half-remembered?" "Because it belongs to one who once clawed at the edges of greatness, Holmes replied, but never breached it. Lennox Vale was a poet of sorts, a contemporary of Bellamy, though less favoured by critics and altogether eclipsed by fashion. Rivalry? More than that, Holmes said. Obsession. He accused Bellamy in his later years of stealing lines, of passing off inspiration as inheritance. He published pamphlets denouncing him, all of which were ignored. And now he resurfaces. Now, Holmes said grimly, he imitates me, which is a form of praise I do not welcome. We returned to Baker Street before dusk had entirely descended. Holmes removed his coat without a word and went straight to the hearth, where the embers glowed red as coals at confession. He did not speak again until the lamplight flickered above us, and even then it was in tones quiet and clipped. There is an author, he said, behind this forgery, but it is not the pen that concerns me. It is the motive that holds the knife. The evening grew still, and Holmes sat with his fingers steepled, his gaze fixed not on any page or diagram, but on the shifting firelight that danced like memory upon the grate. His face, caught between flame and shadow, wore no expression I could place, not anger nor indignation, but something colder still, precision without peace. He spoke at last, and his voice was so soft I barely heard it. Forgers, Watson, deal in appearance. They rely on the viewer's desire to believe. But this is not about belief. It is about erasure. You think Vale seeks to destroy Bellamy? Holmes did not turn his head. No, he said. He seeks to rewrite him. And to do that, he must discredit not the poet, but the truth that outlived him. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the panes like a hand seeking entry. And I knew, though Holmes had not said it, that we would soon meet the man who forged more than words. A man who imitated Holmes not out of malice, but out of purpose. The following evening, under a damp veil of mist that blurred the lanterns of Fleet Street into soft golden wounds, Holmes informed me that we were expected at a tavern which, by his account, had no sign and no reputation, and depends upon that anonymity for both clientele and survival. We walked in silence for some time, the gas lamps casting long shadows across the cobblestones. I had learned long ago that Holmes's silences often contained more strategy than solitude. There was tension about him, not visible in expression, but in the very restraint of his movements, as though every step forward was an act of controlled descent. The establishment itself was buried within a crooked alley off Bride Lane, its door marked only by a narrow strip of brass, tarnished to the hue of old secrets. Inside, the air was thick with pipe smoke and the tang of damp oak. No music, no cheer, only the mutterings of lives in retreat. We were guided, without question, to a rear booth, where the gaslight hissed like a breathing thing. Holmes inclined his head once toward the man already seated there, and I understood, from the slight tightening of his jaw, that we had found Mr. Lennox Vale. Lennox Vale had the look of one who had once aspired to greatness, but now fed on the carrion of memory. His hair was unkempt, his cravat stained with something darker than ink, and his fingers, long, pianist's fingers, twitched occasionally, as though grasping for syllables not yet uttered. He did not rise as we approached. Rather, he gestured grandly to the bench opposite him, as if hosting a symposium in exile. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice lined with the theatre of injured genius. "How charming to be summoned by a ghost, and Dr. Watson no less, the loyal scribe." Holmes sat, neither disarmed nor amused. "You requested the meeting, Mr. Vale. I presume you have not called us here merely to perform your bitterness aloud." Vale chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that failed to reach his eyes. "Oh, but isn't bitterness the only truth left to those denied justice? They erased me, Holmes. Bellamy and his coterie of fashionable frauds. I wrote what he published. I breathed the lines he recited. And now I am the footnote to a forgery." Holmes folded his hands. "Then I assume you've come not to wail, but to barter." Vale's grin widened. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I've brought a price and a page. There was a silence then, the kind that settles not from absence, but from the presence of too much meaning. Vale produced nothing, not yet, but leaned back with the air of a man who believes himself finally in control of the narrative. I hold the final page, he said softly. The one your client would rather see smouldering in a grate than pressed into public memory. A pity. It is perhaps Bellamy's finest work, if one appreciates Confession's pen too late. Holmes's face betrayed no flicker. And what do you propose? Vale's eyes narrowed, gleaming with the cruelty of unmet hunger. I want you, Holmes, to publish the truth. To state, publicly and unequivocally, that Bellamy was a thief, that his greatness was stolen line by line, and that I, not he, was the poet remembered only in silence. You seek vindication. I seek justice, Vale hissed, and I shall not trade the page without it. Holmes regarded him, unmoved. And what of Lady Frances? Vale's lips curled. She inherited not her father's words, but his erasures. Let her inherit the ruin too. He tapped the table once, a poet's beat. Choose, Holmes, truth or legacy. It was then that Holmes did something I had witnessed only a handful of times, and always in the presence of a man already unravelling. He said nothing. Not out of indecision, but as a calculated void, a silence sharpened to a scalpel's edge. Vale waited visibly. His shoulders tensed. His fingers drummed once, then stopped. He glanced between us, seeking reaction, a flinch, a frown, anything to confirm the weight of his threat. Holmes's eyes, fixed upon him, betrayed only the stillness of a mind at work, and something colder too, a refusal to engage on terms set by chaos. Is this your strategy? Vale spat, his voice cracking. To deny me even the satisfaction of rage? Still Holmes did not answer. Vale's composure began to fray. His posture slipped from theatrical to pleading. He destroyed me, he muttered, published my lines as though they were his own, claimed my images, my rhythm, my soul. Still the silence. Only when Vale's breath had grown ragged did Holmes finally speak. There are truths, he said softly, that cannot be reclaimed by shouting them through ruin. Vale blinked, the fire of his cause sputtering, and Holmes added more quietly still, You do not want justice, you want applause. I had been silent until then, more out of instinct than restraint. But as I studied Vale now, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and dread. Here was a man undone not by others, but by the failure of others to recognise him. His eyes, which had once flared with righteous fury, now trembled with something less coherent. They reviewed him, he whispered. They lined the shelves with him, but not me, never me. Do you know what it is to read your own thoughts in another man's binding? He leaned forward, eyes shining. I watched from the gallery as they read his verses, my verses, at his memorial. They wept. I smiled. They called it grief. It was theft. Why not publish your claim? I asked gently. If you have proof. Vale laughed bitterly. And be called mad, a jealous fraud. They would burn the page before they'd credit my name. No, doctor. The truth must fall like a chandelier. It must shatter things. Holmes remained still, but I could sense his mind charting each word, each spiral of thought, not as evidence, but as pathology, and I wondered, not for the first time, if the page itself was real, or merely a mirror to madness. For a long while, the gaslight hissed above us, its glow turning Vale's face into something both spectral and sad. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope, unmarked, weathered, but unmistakably old. He placed it on the table. "I won't hand it to you," he said. "Not unless you understand what it carries." Holmes's eyes never left his. "It is not merely Bellamy's words," Vale continued. "It is a confession, a reckoning. He names her. Lady Frances." "No," Vale said. "Her mother, the woman whose verses he claimed, whose voice he silenced. The page gives her back her name, but in doing so, it removes his." His fingers curled around the envelope, almost possessively. "If you expose this," he said, voice low, "a noble name will hang beside a common one, and it will not be clear which deserves the rope." Holmes said nothing. Vale leaned closer, eyes gleaming. "Will you protect a legacy built on silence, or will you let the truth sing, even if it screams?" And in that moment, I saw how far Vale had travelled. From injured author to moral executioner. He did not wish merely to unmask a thief. He wished to burn the theatre down. Holmes stood without a word. I followed. The tavern's exit creaked faintly as we stepped into the night air, thick with soot and sorrow. I turned once, involuntarily, to glimpse the man we had left behind. Vale sat motionless, his eyes fixed not on us, but on the gas flame above the booth, its hiss the only applause he would ever know. His face, in that moment, was neither triumphant nor defeated. It was expectant, as if awaiting judgment not from Holmes, nor from history, but from the words he had always believed were his. The Morning Post lay untouched upon the corner of our breakfast table, though the kettle had long since cooled, and the fire dwindled to a dull hum in the grate. Holmes sat, unusually still, before a small pile of cloth-bound volumes, the collected works of Sir Alaric Bellamy, each marked with the tidy stamps of various libraries and private collections. He had not turned a page in half an hour, but his gaze remained fixed upon the margins as though seeking not words, but absences. I had seen this posture before, when the trail was not outward but inward, when Holmes was not pursuing a man, but an idea. He reached without speaking to brush dust from one cover, dust that curiously had not settled from neglect, but from deliberate avoidance. "Something lies in what he never printed," Holmes murmured at last, "and perhaps in what he borrowed, without return." Prompted by Holmes's abstraction, I set about examining the slim folder of private correspondence acquired from the archives, a mixture of letters to publishers, brief notes to acquaintances, and marginalia scribbled in the back leaves of borrowed books. The tone of Bellamy's private prose differed subtly from the public voice I had grown familiar with, less adorned, more uncertain, and at times curiously contradictory. There were occasional bursts of florid metaphor that trailed off mid-thought, as if the author had lost confidence in his own imagery. Yet among these I noticed a phrase, slight but repeated, that appeared in two separate notes, both written during the final year of his life. The hush between the rhyme. It struck me at once as oddly poetic, yet too particular to be coincidence. Turning to a half-written draft of a poem included in the folder, never published, I found a variation again, the silence that binds the couplet more than ink. I circled the words and brought the paper to Holmes. "Tell me," I said, "is this Bellamy's genius or someone else's ghost?" Holmes studied it for a long moment before replying, "You have found the seam, Watson. Now let us pull." It was late in the afternoon when Holmes requested I fetch from his private collection a rare volume, one I had seen only once, and then with reverence. The annotated verses of Isidora March Bellamy, published posthumously and scarcely known beyond a few literary circles. He opened it not to the frontispiece but to the middle, to a poem marked in faded pencil, "Between the Lines," and there it was. Fate is not decided in stanza or sigh, but in the silence that hangs between. Holmes did not exclaim. He merely closed the volume, placed it beside the letter I'd shown him, and said, "The same voice, Watson, the same breath, and yet credited to different mouths. I understood then the gravity of what we were approaching. Bellamy had not only been inspired by his wife, he had, it seemed, adopted her very language, her rhythm, perhaps even her grief. If this phrase appears in the missing page, I said quietly, it will not merely scandalize, it will erase him. Holmes nodded once. The poet who dies is mourned, the one who steals dies slower. And from the weight in his tone, I knew the deduction had ceased to be intellectual. It had become moral. Holmes opened a drawer from his desk and retrieved a folded sheaf of paper, a reproduction of Lady Isadora's private journal, obtained, I gathered, from an earlier phase of the case when he had suspected her authorship to be central. I had not known it then. I knew it now. He unfolded the last page, held it to the light, and pointed without comment to a single entry. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was precise, delicate, almost too restrained. Alaric fears silence more than failure. He fills it with rhyme, but it is my silence that bears his name. Holmes read it aloud only once, then laid it beside the Bellamy fragments, the published poem, and the phrase I had found. There, he said, the ghost speaks. He looked not at the papers, but at me. This was no collaboration, it was an eclipse. Bellamy stood in the light of a woman whose words he dressed in his own signature. And the final page? I asked. If Vale spoke truly, Holmes said, it bears a confession, not of guilt perhaps, but of dependence, of theft made respectable by marriage. And her death? I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer. There are few moments in a case where deduction slips into something colder, heavier. The territory not of crime, but of betrayal dressed in propriety. This was one of them. Holmes sorted the pages into two piles, Bellamy's and Isadora's. He studied the paper stock, the edges, the rhythm, not merely as a detective, but as a man dissecting the anatomy of a lie. The same phrases, Watson, the same caesura in line, even the same ink formula. She used a rare German violet, imported in small quantities. Bellamy's later work shows it, but none of his earlier writings do. He leaned back, fingers tapping once against the arm of his chair. She was his muse, yes, but not in inspiration, in function. She wrote, he published, and the public, hungry for the myth of the romantic genius, never questioned the division of labour within a quiet English home. And the missing page, I asked. A deathbed confession, Holmes replied, or a late act of conscience, perhaps to Lady Frances, perhaps only to himself. He folded his hands. And that, Watson, is the most dangerous truth of all, the one that arrives too late for forgiveness, but too early to bury. Holmes stood by the window then, the dusky light tracing the edge of his profile, like a silhouette in ash. His tone, when he spoke, was not heated, but level, and all the more chilling for its calm. Men will kill for credit, Watson, not the coin, but the recognition, the sentence beside their name, the notion that what they touched turned to gold, and that no one else had shaped the ore. He turned, his expression unreadable. Do you know what is more enduring than love, than jealousy, than revenge, authorship? To be remembered not for what one lived, but what one wrote. And yet, I murmured, the name persists while the truth fades. Holmes's lips twitched, not in amusement, but in disdain. Precisely, which is why the page must be found, not for justice, but to stop another man from rewriting grief into glory. That night, while Holmes wrote in silence, I remained by the hearth, watching the fire's slow decline into embers. The name Isadora Bellamy echoed in my thoughts, not as a footnote, but as an erased title page. A woman whose voice may have authored a legacy, but whose death, quiet and unsuspicious, now struck me with an unfamiliar weight. They had said it was illness, a fever, nothing more. But what, I wondered, if it had not been the sickness of the body, but of a life lived behind another man's name? And what, in silence, had she surrendered? It was just after midday when Holmes returned from the museum with a slender folio clutched in one hand and a faint line of ash upon his sleeve. He said nothing as he laid it on the table, only removing his gloves with care and sliding open its worn flap. The familiar scent of archival paper and damp cloth rose at once, along with something subtler, harder to name. This, Holmes said, tapping the edge, was Creutz's private research portfolio. It should contain only transcriptions, translations, and bibliography. Yet, he carefully withdrew one folded sheet. It was thicker than the rest, yellowed by time, its margin bearing the faintest trace of sealing wax. Unlike the other pages, typed and ordered, this one was penned in a familiar, slanted hand. Holmes held it gently between thumb and forefinger. The missing page, smuggled into the folio under the pretense of scholarship, concealed by reverence, not cunning. He laid it flat. Though he did not read it aloud, I saw at the foot of the page a name we knew too well, Bellamy's, beneath a single line of admission. Holmes exhaled slowly. A confession never sent, Watson, and now twice hidden. Creutz arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by a brief but unmistakable note. He entered Baker Street with the bearing of a penitent, his coat unbuttoned, his hat twisted in nervous hands. Holmes did not rise to greet him. "You knew," Holmes began quietly, "that hiding the page would not undo its contents." Creutz stood motionless. "I never meant for it to disappear forever, only to wait until it would do no harm. And yet harm has already bloomed in its shadow," Holmes said. "Did she ask you directly?" Creutz hesitated. "No, but she feared it. She feared that if the page spoke, truly spoke, it would not be her father who suffered, but her mother." His voice faltered, and for the first time, I heard not evasion, but something closer to grief. "She asked me to protect the legacy, but what she truly wished, I think, was to protect the silence. That was her inheritance." Holmes studied him in silence for a moment. "You are not a criminal, Mr. Creutz, but you have allowed loyalty to become complicity." The young man nodded, visibly aged by the knowledge he carried. "Then I leave its fate," he said quietly, "to you." After Creutz departed, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "She believed her mother was the author," he said. "Lady Frances?" Holmes nodded. "From childhood, perhaps. There are traces in her own correspondence, guarded phrasing, sudden shifts in tone when speaking of her father's work, and yet she never said it aloud. Why? Because to voice it would be to destroy both names, her father's honour and her mother's anonymity, which may have been voluntary or not." He gestured to the page. "And that is the true burden of legacy, Watson. Not what we receive, but what we dare not question." I thought of the veiled portrait in Penderyn House, of the study locked against light, of a daughter who protected two shadows at once. "She asked Creutz to hide it," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "She asked no one, but he understood her silence and obeyed it." We returned to Oxfordshire beneath a sky bruised with the bruised shades of late October, not storming, but suspended in that peculiar English stillness which precedes confession or decay. The grounds of Penderyn House looked no different than before, the gate rusted, the gardens asleep. And yet something in the air had shifted. It was as if the house itself knew that truth had drawn nearer. Lady Frances received us in the library. She was composed, as ever, her hair bound simply, her dress dark but unadorned. There was no trace of welcome in her voice, but neither was there resistance. "You have it," she said. Holmes did not answer. He merely produced the page from within his coat and placed it upon the escritoire. She did not reach for it. She only stared, as if the page had always been there, just out of view, waiting to be acknowledged. She read the page in silence. No breath caught, no tear fell, only the smallest quiver passed through her hands, as she reached the final line. Then, without folding it, she turned away. "It is her voice," she said at last. "I knew it would be." Holmes remained still. "I heard it once," she continued, "as a child, in a poem never printed. My father called it a draft. But I knew it was finished, and it was not his." She moved toward the hearth, where no fire had been lit, and stood before the cold grate. I could have lived with her obscurity, but not with the idea that she never wrote at all. Holmes spoke quietly. "You feared exposure." She nodded. "And pity, and scandal, and the scholars who would reduce her to a footnote in a man's biography." Holmes stepped forward and placed the page beside her handkerchief on the mantel. She looked at him once, then reached for the handkerchief instead. With a single steady movement, she struck a match and set it alight. It burned quickly, curling into a ribbon of ash that scattered before reaching the floor. She said nothing, nor did Holmes. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low but resolute. "Legacy is the most fragile fiction," she said, "more fragile even than truth. It survives not by virtue, but by repetition." Holmes nodded once. "And so you prefer the silence?" "I prefer the ambiguity," she replied. "It is the only mercy history allows." Holmes regarded her not as an adversary, but as an accomplice in understanding. There was no triumph in his bearing, only recognition of grief, of choice. "And the page?" She glanced at it without touching it. "Let it rest where it cannot be wielded, nor erased." She turned from the hearth, her figure once again composed, but with a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed. And we took our leave, without farewell and without judgment. Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the page, the original unburnt, into a black envelope, sealed it with wax, and slipped it into a narrow drawer beside his monographs on moral pathology. He did not label it. "Not destruction," he said, "but discretion." I watched as he closed the drawer. "Will you ever reveal it?" Holmes considered. "Only if history forgets her entirely, or if it dares to remember him too fondly." And with that, the matter was done. Outside, the city carried on, its wheels turning, its presses clattering, its names inked onto pages no one would question. But within the quiet of our sitting room, something had shifted. A truth had been spared, but not erased, and a daughter had kept her silence, not out of fear, but out of love for a mother who had never signed her work, yet had written more than any of them knew. The rain had begun at dawn and showed no sign of relenting. It drew long silver veins down the parlour windows of Baker Street, distorting the shapes of passing hansoms and umbrellas into shadowy, shifting forms. The world beyond our sitting room had receded, wrapped in a gauze of grey, as if even London herself were reluctant to be seen. I sat in my usual chair, fingers steepled, watching the rivulets trace their downward course. Holmes had not spoken for nearly half an hour. He occupied the settee with a stillness that was neither contemplative nor weary, only precise. The air between us was weighted with what had not been said. There is a particular silence which follows the solving of a case, not the elation of justice served, but something more complex, more human. A silence that speaks not of victory, but of restraint. I could not help but feel that this, of all our cases, had left a residue upon the conscience, one not easily rinsed away by reason. Without a word, Holmes rose and moved to his desk. I heard the familiar click of the lower drawer and the soft rustle of papers within. From its depths, he withdrew a single sheet, the page, and held it between thumb and forefinger with the delicate touch one reserves for either artifacts or wounds. It looked older than I remembered, its corners slightly curled, the ink paler than on the day it first re-emerged. Yet its presence seemed no less potent. It was, in essence, a ghost, of a confession never spoken, a guilt never fully named. Holmes did not sit. He stood by the hearth, head bent, and ran his eye once more across the lines. I saw no flicker of emotion in his expression, only the tight geometry of a mind unwilling to grant the page more power than it deserved, and yet unwilling to pretend it held none. Holmes exhaled, not from weariness, but from the need to make space for something difficult. Then, with a quiet finality, he read aloud the line at the centre of that long-buried page. If the words were never mine, let them still live in silence, unclaimed, yet undenied. He said no more. The syllables seemed to hover for a moment in the air, neither accusatory nor exonerating. They could have been written in defiance or regret. They were neither a declaration nor a denial, a masterstroke of ambiguity, as precise in its evasion as any legal testimony. I sat forward, feeling at once the pull of meaning and the ache of its absence. Did Bellamy admit to theft, or merely to a boundary he dared not cross? Did he name guilt, or plead ignorance in a tone too elegant to dismiss? Holmes folded the page again. "There is no truth," he murmured, "that cannot be framed as honour by those who write history." For a long while we did not speak. The rain continued its hushed descent, and the fire behind Holmes hissed faintly in response. My thoughts wandered to Lady Frances, to her poised hands, her guarded voice, the fragile composure she had worn like a veil too often refolded. She had not asked us to conceal the truth, and yet every glance, every omission had pleaded for it in a manner more eloquent than words. What she sought was not deception, but protection, for a name, for a legacy, perhaps even for herself. Her silence had been deliberate, and her grief, though undramatized, had been real. I wondered then, was justice always an unveiling? Or could it sometimes reside in what remained hidden, in the mercies afforded by omission? History is a crude archivist. It files by victory and scandal, by dates and declarations. It does not recognize restraint. It does not honor those who keep silence for the sake of others. And so, as Holmes slipped the page into its envelope once more, I felt a strange peace mingled with unease, not because the truth had triumphed, but because it had not. And perhaps, in this rare instance, that was just as well. Holmes sealed the black envelope with wax, not hastily, but with a deliberation I had come to associate with matters of consequence. Then, opening the lowest drawer of his filing cabinet, he placed it atop a stack of folders bound in string and tied it closed. No label was affixed, no category named. Only a Roman numeral etched faintly in chalk on the inside of the drawer. 7. He locked it. "There it shall rest," he said, "for now." I looked to him. And later? He did not turn. Later depends on who seeks it and why. The firelight threw his shadow long against the bookshelves. His voice, when he spoke again, was almost inaudible. "Some lies are bound in leather and shelved for scholars, Watson, but this one shall remain, for now, unread." It was not evasion. It was decision, sharpened by the awareness that truth, once released, cannot be recaged. And in that moment, I saw the rarest of things. Holmes not as a logician or avenger of fact, but as a custodian of silence. A man who, for all his reason, knew the weight of what should not be known. I waited until the coals had dulled and the rain softened into mist. The city beyond our window had become a realm of gaslight and reflection, quiet, tentative, suspended between waking and sleep. And then I asked the question that had haunted me since Penderyn. "Did we do the right thing, Holmes?" He did not answer. He sat in his chair, eyes on the fire, hands tented before his lips in that familiar pose, though tonight it felt less like calculation than repose. I waited. A minute passed. 2. The silence did not crack. Perhaps he did not know. Perhaps he knew too well. Or perhaps some truths, like the page itself, were best left sealed. Not for fear, but for grace. And so I said nothing more. The fire dimmed. The drawer remained locked, and outside, the city slept, unaware that one more secret had chosen to remain, just out of reach, just within memory. We sat before the dwindling fire, the rain having long since ceased its whisper against the panes. Holmes had spoken little since sealing the page away, and I, though tempted to prod, had respected the long silence that often followed his most delicate cases. At length, he stirred, gazing into the amber coals. "There are truths, Watson," he said softly, "that do not lie hidden for want of light, but for fear of the shadow they would cast. The question is never whether we can reveal them, only whether we should. In this case, one truth was kept sealed, not by law, but by conscience. But what do you think? Was Lady Frances protecting a memory or burying a deeper guilt? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm keen to read your theories, and if this quiet puzzle stirred your curiosity, be sure to like, subscribe, and pass it along to a fellow seeker of mysteries.